We will be in Job chapter 25, finishing up this chapter and finishing up the friends, because amazingly enough, they don't have anything more to say. Last week we looked at the first 3 verses, and Bildad has some good stuff to say here. And the more I read over this chapter, and the more I thought about verse 4, and Peter's dealing with false doctrine and how dangerous it is, I started to feel bad for Bildad, because he knows some things about God, but he doesn't get it right. And imagine how many people in the world today know something about God, or they're religious, and they think they're doing pretty good, but they never get the satisfaction that they're looking for. We're going to read the whole thing since there's only 6 verses. Then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, Dominion and fear are with him. He maketh peace in his high places. Is there any number of his armies? And upon whom doth not his light arise? How then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less man that is a worm, and the Son of Man, which is a worm. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, of all the things that we can learn from this book, this really short chapter can be heartbreaking, because there are a lot of folks who know something about you, or they think that they know you, and yet they have missed it by a mile. It is important not only that we are doctrinally sound, but it is important to know for sure that we have a right relationship with you. And there is a huge contrast between what the 3 friends know and how it affects their life, and what Job knows and how it affects his life. And help us to be faithful, help us to be good examples, help us to encourage others that are struggling to find some help in hard times. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I was studying for this, and I couldn't help but in my mind think of vanities, all is vanity. Because you get to the end of this thing, and when you think about what Bildad is saying, he gets to the end and it's not really coherent. It's almost as if he's stuttering in his thoughts and then just shuts up, quits. And nobody else picks up the gauntlet and takes on. So Job is going to carry on from chapter 26 to chapter 31, I think it is, or 32. All the rest of it is Job's responses to things, because we don't hear from the friends anymore. But we looked last time in verses 2 and 3 about the sovereignty of God. And then in verse 4, he's making a point, because Job all along has kept saying, man, I sure wish I could have God show up. I wish I could get God into court and be vindicated. And the point he's trying to make here is, he's going to take one kind of muffled shot, I guess it is, at Job with this statement, how can a man be justified with God, or how can he be clean that is born of woman? And it is an important question that he starts off the first half with. And then we're going to see a doctrinal dilemma, because part of it is right, but his application is messed up, and it's a cold, dreary, miserable way of thinking. And so he asks this question, how can a man be justified with God? It's important to understand the terms. Justified means to be shown to be just or right. And man here is the less dignified word for a man. So basically it's saying any mortal man in general, not any specific man, not exalting man in any way. This is just a common, ordinary, dime a dozen word for man. How can any miserable, sinful person, is what he's saying, expect to be right with a holy God and to quarrel with him when the glorious angels willingly submit. That's what he said in verse 3, right? Who can number his armies? And if you think about it, they do his bidding without hesitation, and they are way better off than us. So why would you, Job, want to enter into his presence? And so it's kind of a quiet challenge here. But the important thing to think about, and this is what made me pause for a little while, Bildad never supplies an answer. It's one thing to bring up a question to somebody, how can a man be justified with God? But listen, if that's all you have to have a discussion with someone, if that's all of the religious conversation that you ever have with somebody, and you go back and forth a little bit, and then you never give them an answer about how somebody can be justified with God, you left them no better off than when you started the conversation. And a lot of times when these three friends speak, they're pretty rough on Job, but they don't even bother to get an answer here. He's making a point to Job about the folly of wanting to be vindicated by God when God is the one judging his sin. And so that is a very lopsided view of God. And while he has great doctrine in some of these verses, and there were a couple of other guys that had some great doctrine throughout, the way they apply it and what it means to their life is drastically missing something. Can't help it. But the suggestion of a religion that believes you can never be sure where you stand with God screams at me from this verse. I mean, for all we know, Bildad could be Catholic, just hoping that he's, moving the balances. He could be a Muslim for all we know. And there's no jihad running, so he can't run out there and blow himself up or kill somebody and die in battle. So maybe he's doing his things because he kind of has a hope-so religion. I get to the end of my life and I hope that God is merciful to me, but I know that he is going to judge. So I'm going to try and be as righteous as I can be, knowing that he judges sin. Now, look at the doctrinal dilemma here in the second half that's magnified from the first half. How can he be clean that is born of a woman? A holy, righteous, just God judges sin. We get that. That is Bildad's stance. That's Eliphaz's stance. All three of them have made that statement in their arguments. In fact, in their line of thinking, because God is just, he must judge sin, and he must bless righteousness. And we'll come back to that at the very end and apply it. But look at Deuteronomy 32 and verse 4. Right towards the end of the law here, it says, he is the rock, his work is perfect. For all his ways are judgment, a God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he. Is Bildad right in his first statement? Absolutely he is. God is a just and holy God. Does he judge sin? Absolutely he judges sin. But the part that he is missing is the rest of the story, if you will. Go to Psalm 7 and verse 11. God judges the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. Well, in their line of thinking, he's judging the wicked, and he's blessing the righteous. But wait a second, it says God judges the righteous also. So it's not a blinders thing where he's beating up on these guys and he's constantly blessing these guys. There is a judgment that is spread across everybody, and that's important. Jump to chapter 9 or Psalm 9 and look at verse 8. He shall judge the world in righteousness. He shall minister judgment to the people in uprightness. Does it say to the wicked? No. It's going to mete out judgment, and we know that you get to the book of Revelation, there are two different judgments. There's one judgment for the saved and there's one judgment for the unsaved. All of that happens in righteousness. So his doctrine about a holy, just God that judges is good. But he struggles a little bit in the application of it. How can a man that is born of a woman be holy, he wants to know. We call that the total depravity of man. A man is totally sinful. There's not one little part of him that's not sinful. There's not a little light in there and you fan it a little bit and pretty soon you can kindle a fire and then it can go on. We aren't born, little spirit beings that start on our religious journey and can eventually be like God. All of those false religions that talk about the various forms of that are nonsense. Because the Bible talks about the total depravity of man. You were born in sin, you continue in sin until there's a transformation that takes place. In Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, let's turn there. There are some phrases that are really important because they tell us a multitude of things that are happening that's really important for us to consider. As it is written, first one, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. So it's one thing to be unrighteous, but if you understand what the situation is, then you have some hope of changing it. But if you don't even understand what the situation is, which means you don't really understand who you are, and you don't really understand who God is, and you don't understand the damnation between the two in an unrepentant state. So, none righteous, no one that understandeth, and then it gets even worse, there is none that seeketh after God. Now, that is an important statement also, because we're not even looking. You're unrighteous, you don't understand how bad a situation you are, and you're not even looking. I don't know how more totally depraved you can get. But he's not done yet. Because he says, they are all gone out of the way, they are together become, unprofitable is a good biblical word for worthless. If something is worthless or useless, there's no worth or value or usefulness to it at all. There isn't a spark in there that can be flamed. And then he settles it and says, they are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And so here you are, if you think you're balancing the scales, and you say, I won't put my good on this side, and the bad's going to be on this side, God says, but wait a second, there's none that doeth good. Well, there goes the scale theory. There goes the hope so theory. I mean, if that's what you were hoping in, and if that's Bildad's religion, can you imagine? I mean, when you ask somebody, do you expect to be able to spend eternity in heaven? And they say, I hope so. That has got to be one of the most heartbreaking, spirit-rending things that you can hear. I mean, at least if they say no, they're kind of on solid ground. Wrong ground, but solid ground. Hope so means they're really wanting to be and have no idea. No idea. Lost at sea. Ephesians 2:1 describes us as dead in our trespasses and sins. What does a dead man accomplish? There goes the scale theory. Psalm 51:5 says, born in sin. So it's not like, well, maybe I can, no, because you started that way and you stayed that way. In Jeremiah 17:9, familiar verse for us, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. Well, that tells me that I'm corrupt at my very core. And I don't know how I can not be polluted all over if I'm corrupt at my very core. I've told you once before, I was driving along with my grandfather, and he pulled off beside his cow pasture and said, Robbie, you want to go jump the Allegheny River? And I was like, are you kidding? Maybe it was the Susquehanna. I get him confused. He said, yeah, the mighty Susquehanna River is right over there. And so I did. And nobody shot at me or yelled at me, so they're probably used to it. I just climbed up a fence post, jumped over there, and jumped across that little creek. And I thought, I would never drink from this water because it's the middle of a cow pasture. They're pooping everywhere. And if you pollute something at the source, how in the world can you hope that it's going to be clean down here? I mean, it's hard enough to have a clean source and then try to keep it clean. But if you're corrupt at the core, and that's what Jeremiah 17:9 says, we're in a lot of trouble. Man is without excuse before God. We know how bad he is, but we know he is. Romans 1:20 says that creation testifies that there is a God. And in John 15:22, we looked at that when we were there. Christ said, if I had not come, they would not be guilty. They would not have known their sin. And so it's pretty obvious through creation and through Christ that we are desperately in need of something. And Bildad's posing this question: how can a filthy human being ever hope to be right with God? And he just leaves it hanging there. The answer to our guilt: well, Bildad, if you are trusting in your own merits, and as we've gone through these 23 chapters of these boys going back and forth, it sure seems like they are, then you're guilty. And you have no hope of being right before God. But there are two good biblical terms, sound doctrine, that changes everything. One of them is justification, and one of them is justification is the act of God whereby we are made or accounted just. Not that we're viewed just. That's important. Sometimes in trying to make complicated words simple, justification, just as if it never happened. Oh, cool. So I can act like it never happened. That's not what the term means. The term means that we are made or accounted as if it never happened. Therefore, we can function free from guilt and the penalty of sin. Treated as if it never happened might be a really good way of explaining it. But I don't act as if it never happened. I know it happened. I just act in the freedom of knowing that I'm not accountable for it. And there's a big difference between the two. Acts chapter 13, verse 39, Romans 3, 20 through 28, chapter 5, verse 9, and 8:30, all deal with those. Good verses. Romans is full of very, very doctrinally sound, practical chapter in Romans. And then the second term, redemption. This is the act of atoning for guilt, which brings up a third biblical word, atonement. The satisfaction or the payment of a wrong. Now, you go into a courtroom and you say, I didn't think I was speeding. And the officer presents his stuff and they say, guilty. You have to pay the fine. You have to go into the room over there and pay the fine. You can't just say, well, I promise I'll never do it again. And they say, okay, paid in full. You can't walk in there and say, how about I give you a bunch of bananas, some tomatoes, and they'll say, nope, that is not acceptable payment. We take US dollars in this amount. And when you pay the fine in a way that is satisfactory to the court, that's when they clear your account and stamp it, and you're done with it, and nobody has the right to come back and charge you for it again. Same thing happens with a car loan or a mortgage payment. It has to be paid in a way that satisfies the person that extended it. Okay? And so justice isn't violated by redemption or atonement. It is satisfied because it's paid in full with an acceptable payment. And that's the importance of Jesus Christ. Because no man is going to be acceptable payment for his own sin. How can a sinful person be an acceptable sacrificial lamb for his own sin? You have to have the perfect, sinless Son of God as the sacrifice for our sin. Go to Hebrews chapter 9 and look at verse 12. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 12. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. In redemption, we were bought back. He owns us because he created us. All we like sheep have gone astray. He bought us back. Now, I want you to go to 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. Because 2 Corinthians describes it in great terms, banking transaction that happens here. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. For he hath made him, Jesus Christ, to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. You see the transaction? You have over here no sin, you have over here sin. He made Jesus Christ to be sin for me when he knew no sin, that we might have the righteousness of him. So this transaction takes place. He takes my sin and pays for it on the cross of Calvary, and in return he gives me his righteousness. So when I go into the courts of heaven and approach the throne of grace, I am not approaching the throne of grace on any of my own merits. And that's what Bildad's missing. Poor old Bildad is sitting here stuck in the fact that I got to try and be righteous because God's going to bless the righteous and he is going to beat up on these wicked folks, even though Job over and over and over again has said, buddy, that is not true. That is not practically true while we're here on this earth. Is it true eventually? Yes. There is judgment sometime, but the wicked get away with a lot of stuff, and the righteous are not always blessed, or we wouldn't have martyrs. So creates a dilemma. Let's think about Job. Job in chapter 1, verse 1 is described as a complete individual, which means undefiled, whole, upright, feared God, hated evil. Those four characteristics is what God chooses to tell us about Job when he's introducing the book. Complete, undefiled man, holy. He is upright. He fears God and he hates evil. He knows that he is right with God. You say, how in the world can he know he's right with God? Because even though 1 John 5:13 isn't written yet, he's always been able to. In salvation, you know that your sin has been dealt with. He is holy living. That's why it says he is upright and complete. And he has been confessing his sin. Not only his sin, but he's also sacrificing for his family. This is a man who hates sin, fears God, and acts like it. So he trusts in the character of God. We've seen that throughout the chapters. Sound doctrinal basis. Sound in his, when he describes the character of God, we've seen him go back and forth. Man, I would love to be in a courtroom and be able to ask God, but then what would I say? Because he is so high and holy, and I'm not. So what am I supposed to say before such a high and holy God, even though he's the one that can vindicate me? The Word of God, what he knows that God has said, the promises, he stands on them. And he understands that he has a mediator, Jesus Christ. Job is looking forward to the cross, just like Moses or Abraham looking forward to the cross. And Bildad's struggling. He is standing steadfast in his integrity. Here is a man that knows he is walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And these other three friends cannot fit him into their religious system because they have God in a box. So look at the moral dilemma, or the doctrinal dilemma, of Bildad. He is limited to God to fit his religious system. A lot of false religions do that. God rewards the righteous, God punishes the evil. Big storms came through last night. Somebody sinned. That's all I'm saying. One of y'all sinned, and God was mad, so he sent these big storms in, and now we're going to have to do some kind of sacrifice, or somebody's going to have to do something to appease God. That's the way a lot of false religions work, and that's the way these three friends are going at it. You see something that happens in the world, we've made God mad somehow. And so now we have to try and deal with that and fix it. He knows some of the character of God. But the problem with knowing some of the character of God is if you focus on the fact that he is holy and he's just and he judges, but you never think about his mercy or his love or his grace, boy, you have a really unbalanced view of who he is. And so you have an unbalanced view and an expectation of how he acts. So here's the problem Bildad faces. He cannot understand how someone could come boldly before God with a request. Here's Job saying, boy, I would love to be able to talk with God. I would love to have God come down here so I could go into a courtroom and lay out my complaint, and then he could tell me what's going on. And he misunderstands Job, and they think that that's pride. And they think, oh, wow, man, Job is really messed up because Job doesn't fit into their way of thinking because they've got God in this box. And Job's over here running in what we would call spiritual freedom, knowing that he's right with God. What he thinks about God and what he sees in the world doesn't always match. And Job has brought that up over the last couple of chapters, and so these guys are having a harder and harder time coming to Job with anything to say because he's right. Job's right. How do you argue with that? And I got to tell you, he doesn't seem to have a personal relationship with God. He doesn't really know him. He just knows a little about him. And I'm afraid that that's true of an awful lot of folks today. They go to Sunday school, or they go to a church somewhere, or they get their God on, or they use those other phrases to describe some religiosity, and they know about him, but they do not really know him. And so the biggest problem is a heavenly mediator between us and God is foreign thinking to poor Bildad. So he asks this question, and it's a good question, and it's a great doctrinal question. He just doesn't have an answer to it. And it's kind of a heartbreaking shame that he doesn't have an answer to it. How can a man be justified with God? Because I can't think of how a filthy human being could come before a holy God. Then to prove his point, in verses 5 and 6, he's going to talk about the purity and the glory of God. In verse 5, he compares them to the heavens, and in verse 6, he compares them to human beings. First of all, look at verse 5. Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. The moon, in comparison, is a dark lump compared to the luster of God's glory. Now, sometimes you go outside on a full moon, and it lights up the sky. I mean, you can walk through the yard, you can see all kinds of stuff. You can be down in the woods and see things. But the moon is very inconsistent because it continues to go through its phases. And so sometimes it's shining really bright, and sometimes it's only half there, and sometimes it looks like a fingernail clipping, and then it looks like a fingernail clipping on the other side, and then it's hardly there at all. And it has shadowed places on it. If you go out even during a full moon and look up there, you can tell that there's craters up there, right? Because there's imperfections in shadowy places. And when you look at God, you don't see imperfections in shadowy places. And sometimes it's completely hidden from view. I absolutely did not go out in the middle of the night last night to see if I could see the moon or the stars. Because I was pretty sure, considering the clouds that were flying over and all the fog and the storm that was happening, there wasn't a chance I was seeing the moon or the stars last night. So he is comparing it to this, and it's almost as if he is saying it seems like the moon has failed to please God because it's not bright enough or glorious enough. But then he's going to move on and he's going to compare him to man. And this is an interesting verse because he uses two different words for man and he uses two different Hebrew words for worm. And again, the Holy Spirit's doing it intentionally. Man is a mortal. This is the same word that we saw before in verse 4. Not the more dignified word. And worm here is a maggot. So it is a putrefied, corrupt thing. This is the worm that eats you when you die. And so he's trying to get across a point here. He says, how much less any general good-for-nothing man that is like a maggot. I don't think anybody likes maggots. I mean, I like fishing worms good enough because you fish with them, but I don't want maggots crawling on me or touching them or nothing because they're nasty. They're on dead stuff. Everything about them stinks. That is exactly the point that he's making here. And then he says, and the Son of Man, which is a worm. And you say, well, he already said that. Man's a worm. Son of Man's a worm. But man here is the word Adam. So he's saying any general, ordinary, scumbag man is a maggot. And a man, a human being, a descendant of the first Adam, corrupted by sin, is a worm, a crawling worm, a weak, groveling thing. Go to Psalm 22 and look at verse 6. Talk about somebody having trouble with their self-identity. Psalm 22:6. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. Not painting a really good picture here. So what's the conclusion that Bildad comes to before he is quiet? God is so high and lofty, why would he have anything to do with us? But you know what? Isn't that what makes salvation so great? He seems to deny the human worth as something that is given by God. But we know that in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, and in chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, let us create man in our image. And he didn't breathe into anything else the breath of life. He created it alive. But he breathed into Adam the breath of life, and he gave him dominion over everything else. And so, yes, we are sinful. And if all you look at is the sinful side of man, it's easy to say, oh, miserable wretch that I am. But God doesn't leave people as miserable wretches. That's the whole point. The fact that he is so holy, and the fact that we are so not, is what makes salvation in Jesus Christ so absolutely amazing. Because Romans 5:8 says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He knew what he was getting into, and he humbled himself and was obedient to the cross, because that's how much he loved us. And Bildad's missing that whole side of the discussion. Amazing love. How can it be? Isn't that such a wonderful song in the hymnal? We could probably sit here and spit out a dozen to 15 of them that are similar in their wording. And they're so great because of this fact. Bildad asked the question, how can a rotten, sinful man ever be right before God? You wish somebody jumped up and said, Bildad, dude, here's the gospel. Brother, all the way back from Adam in Genesis chapter 3. I want to close with these two statements. Such a tragedy that the three friends end their speeches on such a disgusting and hopeless note, viewing man as a maggot and a crawling worm, and posing a question, how can that disgusting worm ever be right before God? And then shut your mouth not to be heard of again, and you haven't answered the most important question in the whole wide world. Because eternity is based on the answer to that question. Let alone, forget that we're trying to help Job struggling over here. We've skedaddled past helping Job and asked this huge question that seems to be a hole in these three guys' heart, and they have no answer to. So from here on to chapter 31, Job presses on alone. The friends are confused, they're disgruntled, and now they're silent, with no real answers to life's hard questions. And that's why I wanted to, when I started digging into the second half of this chapter, I thought, nope, we're gonna dig into this a little bit more, because it dovetails with the vanity of Ecclesiastes and the concern Peter has for the church about false doctrine. When we do not have sound doctrine and a right relationship with God, we don't have the real answers to life's hard questions. Now, that's what happens with false religion. And actually, that's what happens with religion in general. Because the Pharisees and the Sadducees thought they were righteous, and what did Jesus Christ call them? Whitewashed sepulchres, vipers, filthy cups. Can you imagine when they stood before God? The shock? Because they thought that they were defining his law so much better and coming up with all this trying to be righteous, and they completely missed the point. They knew about God, but they didn't know him. And when we get to the end of here, that's the conclusion I draw about Job's friends. Now, they've come up with some good doctrine from time to time, and they think that they're very religious. But they are not saved individuals, and they have a hole that has not been satisfied. And to this point in their life, if you're going to talk about their religion, I would bring in the preacher. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. It's empty. It's chewing the wind. That is not what Job needs in the middle of his suffering. And that's not what anybody else needs in the middle of their suffering either. Empty religion. They need what Job has. Rock solid, standing, steadfast on who God is, what his word says, and a right relationship with him. What an incredible contrast we see in just this short little chapter. Praises or prayer requests tonight? Keep praying for Nathan. He's supposed to have surgery here, reconstructive stuff on his face, and Harless had said in Sunday school that they were waiting for the parts to rebuild eye sockets. Can you imagine? Oh, I don't know if they've gotten that in or what's going on, but I'm sure that sounds like some hard surgeries ahead. Awana starting in a month. Keep praying for Miss Faye and her family. It's good to see Pam brought her to church again. I know that does her heart real well. Anything else? Brianna's getting close. 14 days. Is that right? Keep praying everything goes well there. Volunteer to close us in prayer tonight.
Missionaries,